Roger Williams, the First Rebel, by Katherine Christensen
and Elizabeth Cranford.
It all started in 1631 when a man named Roger Williams came over to America with his wife Mary. Archbishop Laud was the one who pushed him into either leaving England or swearing the oath of allegiance to the Church of England. However, Williams was a very godly man, and he refused to swear the oath. This led him to fleeing the country and becoming an American rebel. When he arrived on shore in Massachusetts, he was offered the position of leading the church immediately. However, he declined it, stating that it was not godly enough of a church for him to work at. 5 years later, in 1636, he was convicted in court for his radical religious beliefs. Therefore, he fled the state of Massachusetts, becoming a rebel once again. He went to Rhode Island, where he met and was inspired by many of the native people there. This can be seen through his anapestic poetry. Anapestic poetry is when a metrical foot consisting of two lightly emphasized syllables is followed by one heavily emphasized syllable. An example of an accent from his anapestic poetry would be in the first line of his poem, Salutation.
The courteous pagans shall condemn uncourteous Englishmen, who live like foxes, bears, and wolves, or a lion in his den. You can see his worldview clearly through the poems as he describes the Native Americans and compares and contrasts their way of living to that of the Englishmen. Continuing to break down this first stanza, it reads, "The courteous pagans shall condemn uncourteous Englishmen." This reflects on his past with Englishmen kicking him out of Massachusetts and being taken in by hospitable natives. His past helped shape his worldview, which in turn shaped his writing. The second stanza goes on to speak favorably of the natives, with the line, "These wild barbarians with no more than nature go so far." Williams refers to the resourcefulness of Native Americans as he continues to compare and contrast them to his fellow countrymen. The second poem from chapter 2 is about eating and entertainment. It has several mentions of God's provision for the natives, which is something Williams often mentioned in his other works. The imagery of this poem begins with coarse bread, which is a main part of the English diet. Coarse bread and water's most, their fare, O England's diet fine. He describes the diet of England in order to compare it to what God has provided for the Native Americans. He goes on to show assonance in a line of this first stanza stating, "Thy cup runs o'er with plenteous store." One can see how this is assonance because it repeats the vowel sounds of or in the line. He continues into the second stanza writing, "Sometimes God gives them fish and flesh," which again shows his Christian worldview and also shows consonance, which is the repetition of consonant sounds in the words fish and flesh. Williams refers to even though they might have not always had much, they are content without, and they are content to share even what they have with strangers, as he refers to later in his poem. The first line of the last stanza reads, "God's providence is rich to his." This shows how strong Williams' faith was in his assurance that God takes care of his own. The proof he gives of this faith is provided at the end of the poem as an example of God's provision. The last sentence of the poem shows an important biblical allusion. The line, "In wilderness, in great distress, the ravens have fed me," alludes to the biblical story of Elijah, lost in the wilderness, being fed by birds that were sent by God. Not only does this show his faith, which is so prevalent in his works, it also brings back memories of the time he was lost in great distress, exiled from his home for his beliefs, and taken in by a people that was not his own.
In his next poem, he writes about his travels in the sea because he was exiled from his brethren, and how he saw the hand of God while on the ocean. He uses artistry in his own unique arrangement to help elicit deep emotions from the audience. His poem reads as follows: "They see God's wonders that are called through dreadful seas to pass." This is to describe how terrible sea life can get between sickness and raging storms, as he lists here, in tearing winds and roaring seas, calm calm as smooth as glass. I have in Europe ships oft been in King of Terror's hand. When all have cried, now we sink, alone mongst Indians in canoes. Some time o'erturned I have been, half inch from death in ocean's deep. God's wonders I have seen. Here he is mocking his fellow countrymen and their fear of dying among the savages. He is using this imagery as a symbol almost of their cowardness and their misguided beliefs about who the savage really is. The rich images used here help the audience to connect to his worldview and merge it with their own. This pays homage to how unique his writing is and how revolutionary some of his ideas were. While he talks about his close or near-death encounters in this sea poem, he goes into further detail in his family and business of the house poem, in which he records as such. How busy are the sons of men, how full their heads and hands, what noise and tumult in our own and eke in pagan lands. Here he is again calling out his countrymen, asking them, how are they too busy with their heads and hands that they cannot look at the world around them and find God's will for them to share? If one looks closely at the tone of the language used in this line, one can clearly see how hurt he is by being deserted by his countrymen here, and how he has grown to love those of the pagan land. He has grown to love them so much that he created the first ever Baptist church in Rhode Island.
Part of his work in the church included translating religious works and educating the English on how to witness to the natives in their own language. In his book, A Key into the Language of America, he includes a translation of Native American phrases after the poems we discussed before. Williams not only teaches basics of the language in the book, he teaches his country how to have a conversation with the natives. He showed them respect in a way that most early explorers and colonists did not. Along with direct translations on how to converse with Native Americans, he provided information on the Native American views of God and religion. Williams compares the religious beliefs of the natives to that of the Englishmen. He states that the natives believe that God made them, but there is a disconnect between the God that made them and the God that made the English. He explains that the natives believe that God is angry at them when unfortunate things happen, but they acknowledge their God's hand in a bountiful harvest. While Williams and the natives had differences in what they believed about religion, they were both able to use a common language similar to the language Dixon used in Williams' poems as listed before and after.
The diction that he has used in all of his poetry so far has been low or common speech diction. This is important because it helps to convey the worldview of the author in a way that is easily understandable for the common reader. He continues on with his family and business of the house poem starting in the next stanza. Yet I have found less noise, more peace in wild America, where women quickly build a house and move away. In this stanza, one can see how he relates to the people who are constantly moving around and have no given home, as he has no given home because of England and the colonies banishing him. Yet one can see in this next stanza how he is using this as a carpe diem poem. England and Indians busy are in parts of their abode, yet both stand idle still till God's call set them to work for God. This is the perfect example of a carpe diem because it is talking about how life comes to an end for all mankind, whether they are barbarians or not. While they are both busy, they are slaves to the shortness of life. Everything in this poem is unified and leading to one goal in the end, which is the end of life.
His next poem is similar in the fact that it is talking about the shortness of life and how God influences that. It goes as follows: God makes a path, provides a guide, and feeds in wilderness. And skipping on, no house but hollow tree in stormy winter night, no fire, no food, no company. And skipping on again, no cup so bitter, but's made sweet, when God shall sweetening be. In the last poem we went over, it displayed unity, and this poem displays variety in unity because it works toward the common goal of death at the end of the poem and discusses many different unified images along the way.
In his next poem, he is again comparing and contrasting the Englishmen with native people of Rhode Island. However, he is using allusions from the Bible yet again. He is using these allusions from the Bible to shame the people of England into seeing how they are embodying the very people they teach their children not to embody. The first stanza is insulting their honor and reads as follows: "Truth is a native naked beauty." This line states that the natives are the truthful ones. Then he continues, "But lying inventions are, but Indian paints disassembling their hearts, beauty, not but a lie." Truth is the proper beauty of God's saints. This is stating that this Indians' form of lying is merely a part of their culture with their body paints, where they make themselves appear differently. Therefore, he is alluding to the fact that while the native people are pure in that aspect, his countrymen are not. He is attempting to convey here the absolute horror of his countrymen's behavior. He continues to insult his countrymen by stating, "Foul are the Indians' hair and painted faces, more foul such hair, such face in Israel." This is referring to how the people of England refer to the native people. He then goes to insult their insinuations. "England so calls herself, yet there's Absalom's foul hair and face of Jezebel." This is an allusion to one of the worst princes of the Bible. So by calling England after Absalom, he is not only insinuating that they are an embarrassment to all humankind, but that they are prideful and shallow. And by relating England to Jezebel, he is calling them a harlot and a pagan. Jezebel was the worst queen of the Bible. After calling them out and comparing them to some of the worst people in the Bible, he continues with his berating of England. "Paints will not abide Christ's washing flames of fire. Feigned inventions will not bide such storms." In this section, he is stating how Christ will wash away the paints and lies of the native people. However, what they have done will not wash away as easily. He is stating once again reasons for why the native people are not the barbarians, but rather why the people of England are the true barbarians, and how they are not civilized in way of common decency and morals. He does state hope for his countrymen in this next line: "Oh, that we may prevent him that betimes repentance tears may wash off all such forms." This gives hope to the English that they can still be redeemed from their current iniquities. He even went so far as to write his countrymen several letters to explain the work that he was doing and the wonderful aspects of the Native Americans. He starts out using what the modern reader would discover as high diction, but in reality it is low or common speech diction. This discrepancy is due to the decay of the English language throughout time. He begins with a very polite opening to every courteous reader. However, after this polite opening, his tone changes to one of frustration and even despair. He calls out his countrymen and where he believes that they have strayed from God's will, while I plead the case of truth and innocency against the bloody doctrine of persecution for cause of conscience. I judge it not unfit to give alarm to myself and all men who prepare to be persecuted or hunted for cause of conscience. The author Williams uses very strong rhetoric in his letter in order to be very firm in his convictions with the people. While Williams is obviously very hurt by his countrymen, he continued to write to them things like these poems and letters in hope that they would realize the errors of their ways. He still loved his brethren and continued to minister to the Native American people for a good portion of his life. However, his work in translating things from their language is the true thing that sets him apart from other missionaries and pioneers of his time. In honor of Roger Williams and his work, let us close on this note from him: "I remain studious of your common peace and liberty, your unworthy countryman, Roger Williams."